Tonight, on this holiest of nights, we stand at a crossroads between withholding and forgiveness, between fear and faith, between life and death. And in the gaps between each of those extremes, we are asked to consider who we really are, how we choose to live, how we grapple with the truth of ourselves when all else is stripped away. What is Kol Nidre if not a call to come out of hiding, to stand before the Holy One, and finally face ourselves, past, present, and future. Yom Kippur asks us to look squarely at all of our darkness, failing, and loss, and to find out who we will be as we reinvent ourselves going forward in this new year. I have thought much about loss and the way we move through it since last we gathered on Yom Kippur. From the world stage to our private lives, I've watched us all, so many, square off with the different faces of mortality and struggle, and maybe like you, attempt to work out who we will become on the other side of it. On the public stage since last Yom Kippur, we said goodbye to some treasures who shaped our country, our lives, and our world. Tonight we remember Israeli writer Amos Oz, an American writer Herman Wouk, comic genius and real superhero Stan Lee, President George H.W. Bush, and Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. We think about great sports greats like Bill Buckner, Frank Robinson, Bart Starr, brilliant author Toni Morrison, and poet Mary Oliver. And of course, who could forget the woman who brought to the small screen a Jewish role model from New York in Rhoda Morgenstern, scarf and all, so convincingly played by Valerie Harper. We think of these and so many more, realizing that each of these very well-known individuals had people in their lives brought to profound sadness and reckoning by their deaths. The same is true for us in our own lives. And as the year unfolded, we experienced with many of you struggles and loss in our congregation and in our community. I think about the children, the parents, the spouses, the in-laws, the grandparents, the siblings, the teachers, and the friends who are no longer with us. Yet they are deeply woven into the fabric of our lives, and we miss them greatly tonight, especially tonight. And I realize that in each of these moments, we have been open and vulnerable. We must make decisions about how we will endure, move forward, and find meaning in our lives tonight and every next day after that. On October 27th, the losses in the news and those close to home collided. 11 strangers that we did not know woke up that Shabbat morning dressed as we are dressed right here, right now, and simply went to Shabbat services, only to lose their lives in seconds at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. 11 lives cut short in a manner that makes personal loss even more confounding. In that instant, American Jews, shocked to our core at the resurgence of violent anti-Semitism right here, in a country to which our ancestors immigrated as a haven from such things in the rest of the world. Now, we hear the shofar this year as a wail and a scream. Jews once again being murdered solely because they are Jews in Pittsburgh and in Poway. And such an act of senseless anti-Semitic violence, I wonder tonight what the family and friends of Joyce and Richard and Rose and Jerry and Cecil and David and Bernice and Sylvan and Daniel and Melvin and Irving are experiencing in Pittsburgh, and Lori and her family in California. I wonder what they're all saying tonight. Those in Pittsburgh displaced from their shuttered synagogue building as they grapple to find meaning within these days of awe. There, at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where my own parents married on July 4th, 1960, in that very sanctuary. The irony that the very name Tree of Life drives home the paradox that I wrestled with all year long. How in the face of such tremendous pain and loss can the promise of that Tree of Life be true or even possible? I think the symbol of the Tree of Life is eerily significant as we navigate the dark places that we have all been this year. Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life, is one of our most potent symbols. From the first Tree of Life and knowledge planted in the Garden of Eden, trees are seen as a bridge between heaven and earth, a symbol of the connection between human beings, Torah, and God's divine presence. As it says in Proverbs, Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. Our tradition offers that the Tree of Life has transformative power. We are taught to believe that our full heart convening in nature can transcend. We hold fast to it. I really wonder, whether we or any people facing personal loss or mortal intolerance can find some strength and meaning in Eitz Chaim. That like trees, we can bend in the wind without breaking, spread out to find water, use our roots to steady and support those next to us. Like the leaves, we can change. We can become a source of sustenance and shade and oxygen for those nearby. This is the central question that Yom Kippur brings us. When we stand at the edges of fear and faith, is it realistic or even possible in the face of all that we have or will endure to cling to the idea of a tree of life and find hope? Is it really, as Debbie Friedman sang to us right here in our congregation, the words of Psalm 126, Hazorim Badima Barina Yiksoru, those who sow in tears, will they really reap in joy? It is said that if despair is giving up on the future, then hope enables us to have some faith in it and to keep moving forward even when it seems impossible. Hope is not the same as optimism. Optimism is confidence in a positive outcome. Hope is what keeps us going when things don't turn out the way that we wish. Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, former Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, writes, optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It takes no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. Knowing what we do of our past, no Jew, Jonathan Sachs writes, could ever be an optimist. But Jews have never, despite a history of sometimes awesome suffering, Jews have never, ever given up hope. I know our deep personal losses and national terrors like Pittsburgh are enough to test this notion, but nowhere was the truth of this more profoundly challenged for me than when last spring, Julie and I and a group from our congregation visited Krakow, Warsaw, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Amsterdam. For me, this visit was a first. It was long overdue. I had been to Terezin. I had been to Dachau. I even stood at the ravine in Babi Yar. Yet when our group stood together at the place where Auschwitz transpired, where as many survivors have written, Planet Auschwitz, at the place where the trains, the exact spot where the trains unloaded their human cargo, I had this amazing sense of deja vu. I had never been there, we had never been there. And we had always been there. It was like any other place that I have ever been. Like many of us, I've read so many books and listened to scores of testimonies. I've watched movies, heard lectures, seen photographs of the barracks, the shoes, the glasses, the prayer shawls, and the mounds of hair. I knew what had happened there. But in that moment of touching history touched me right back. And honestly, there seemed to be no tree to cling to in that cold, dark air. As I walked through the camps, I felt this sense of rising pain and anguish, which I and many of us keep compartmentalized. We hold it at bay, accessing it only on rare occasions. But as I traversed the cursed ground, which had borne the weight of so many millions, the floodgates opened. And as the poem we read there said, those who have died have never left. The dead are not under the earth. They are not in the rustling trees. They are in the rustling trees. They are in the groaning woods. They are in the crying grasses. The dead are not under the earth. Those who have died have never left. And it was only hours after pacing the walls and halls of the unthinkable, the unimaginable, all day long, that the truth about our tree of life and the path to hope and joy became somewhat clear to me. Once again, it was the writing of Elie Wiesel, who wrote one line that I committed to memory. Because I remember, I despair, he wrote. ... Because I remember, I have the duty to reject despair. And it was in that rejection of despair that I was able to walk the alleyways of the Warsaw Ghetto that next day and think about our very own Lucy and Felix Horn, the last couple married in the Warsaw Ghetto by the Rabbi, and feeling their hope and joy that through their fear they flushed their ketubah down the toilet so that they wouldn't be discovered as Jews, and they ran and they hid in the woods. And then we walked along the yellow daffodils planted along the memorial route from the museum to the train plaza, next to Mila 18, next to Mordechai Anilevich's house. And I saw with new eyes, like trees, even those daffodils reject the despair with their yearly beauty. And I think about the many who actually had no answers of how to get to hope, but only that rejection of despair was their anchor, to anchor their tenacity and their bravery. And I can hear their voices. There is something mysterious in all of us, built into our being, that gives us hope, even when by all logic, there is no more hope left. So wrote Kenner Markowitz's grandfather, Philip Markowitz, in his memoir, My Three Lives. Chicago survivor Estelle Laughlin writes, "All I remember was the patch of blue sky. That was my only connection to freedom, to life. As long as I could see the sky, I had hope." And then we traveled to Amsterdam. And on the walls of the secret annex, I read Anne Frank, who would have turned 90 in August this year, who wrote on June 6, 1944, at the age of 14. She wrote in her small little diary, "Where there's hope, there's life. It fills us with fresh courage and makes us strong again." If she can have hope, can I? I followed the footsteps of Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was different from his fellow psychiatrists like Freud and Adler, who came before him. He believed that everything he needed to know about life he learned as an inmate in Auschwitz. There, in the midst of the worst suffering on earth, Frankl discovered that people were more likely to survive if they had something to live for. If they could just find something that gave their life meaning. And he reasoned that if he could find meaning for his life in the place of utter despair of Auschwitz, then a human being can find meaning in any circumstance. Frankel's legacy to us is captured in one simple sentence. So simple and so important. In man's search for meaning, a person is not destroyed by suffering. He or she is destroyed by suffering without meaning. The rejection of despair within despair is what made hope and courage possible then and now. And this was driven home by the news story just last week of the shofar that was blown at Auschwitz. Professor Judy Tudor-Schwartz, the director of Holocaust research at Bar Ilan University in Israel, is the daughter of Kol Nidre, the man who facilitated that astounding feat. Nidre was tasked with organizing work details for his fellow prisoners and helped a group of pious men on Rosh Hashanah to celebrate the holiday. Nidre dispatched them to perform less supervised tasks that day, enabling them to say the high holiday prayers undetected. When they returned, they told him that the covert service had even included the blowing of a shofar that had been kept hidden for that purpose. 6 months later, in January of 1945, as the Russian army began to advance, the German guards moved Auschwitz inmates westward towards Germany. Tens of thousands were sent on these death marches, including Nidre. At the beginning of the journey, according to the daughter's account, a prisoner handed the rag-wrapped shofar to her father, saying he was certain to die on the trip, but he wanted the world to know that the shofar had been blown at Auschwitz. The men and women who performed these acts of religious observance, they were living examples of the biblical words, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. In the quiet of my heart, 75 years later, I can hear the sound of that shofar. I can hear what they felt. As the gap between fear and faith on this Day of Atonement gets smaller, the Auschwitz shofar is not just a historical artifact on display this month for the very first time in New York at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. The shofar carries a profound message. Even in times of peace and prosperity, in our despair, hopelessness seems to be the only rational response. But the prisoners with the shofar at Auschwitz show us that at the doorstep of hell, we must recognize and at once reject our despair, thus making way for our own individual path to hope and joy. If they can have such faith, so can I, and so can every one of you. Tomorrow morning, Casey's going to read yet again from the Torah portion, Nitzavim. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. And she's going to say it so strong, and she's going to say it so loud. She's going to say, choose life so that you and your children will live. Even in our people's darkest times, this rejection of despair is the catalyst that keeps the connection to the tree of life alive. It's true in our private places of pain. It's true in Poland. It's true in Pittsburgh. And it's true right here in Glencoe. As individuals, we live with trauma. As Jews, it's just part of our DNA. We have been and always will be a community that seems to sleep with one eye open, always watchful, always nervous. We are sensitive to threat, and we have a heightened awareness of human suffering in general. Among the lasting effects of our history, we have become incredibly careful, incredibly vigilant, incredibly compassionate. And now, we've become weary. On this Yom Kippur, we can understand the narrative more deeply to include a moral message. Whatever we may encounter, each and every one of us, it is through the adaptation to despair, and then the resistance of it, that a human being can find meaning in their circumstances, in any circumstances. This is how we live with hope and dignity, how we rise above the raging torrent, and how we survive with grace and with love. How incredibly fitting. Tonight, we officially dedicate on the southern side of Shalom, right on the street, right by the garden, right by Lincoln. We dedicate a small little sapling of a tree from the children's tree in Terezin. This is an amazing story, and there's a picture of the tree that we just planted. Irma Lauscher was a prisoner and a teacher at Terezin, and she wanted to emphasize hope in some way to her students, so that she arranged to have a small sapling of a silver maple tree smuggled in the boot of a guard that she was able to pay off. They smuggled in the tree and they planted it behind the building where the children lived. And after planting it, the children danced around the sapling and used their rationed water to take care of it. And for months and years, they watched it grow. They placed a sign in front of it that says, "As the branches of this tree, so the branches of our people." Another child, a girl, wrote this poem. Here were three things the Nazis could not take from us. They could not take the blue sky above us for our gazing. They could not take the flood of sunlight pouring into our courtyard, nourishing our tree and us. And most of all, they could not take our invisible God, who remained deep, deep in our hearts. The tree was not forgotten. And after the war, cuttings were sent around the world. And from these seeds grew new trees of life that honor the memory of the children of Terezin. The Illinois Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Chicago Botanic Gardens partnered in making this tree available. Actually, they were able to split their seeds and grow about a dozen trees. And we are so honored. We are so honored to have one. And it will continue to grow, and its branches will now be our branches. And every time you see it, as you walk into our building, as you walk down Lincoln Avenue, I want you to remember, and I want that tree to remind you, that within the struggle and the pain and the loss that each and every one of us feels, we have a path to hope. We see that path together in the warm, tight embrace of this special Shalom community. It is here that you feel your roots firmly planted and interlocked with those around you. It's here, right here, that the wind may cause you to sway, but we're not going to allow you to break. It's here that we're going to always have hope. We're going to reject despair. Hazorim Badima Barina Yiksoru. Maybe Debbie Friedman was right. It may take some time. For the people who blew the shofar, it's taken 75 years. It may take a lot of time. But those who sow in tears, will one day reap in joy.